Irony is the preferred language of progressive politics, and nowhere is this more clear than in the present predicament of the American Democratic Party, particularly when we look at the issue of the United States House of Representatives and the current makeup therein. Currently, the Democratic Party, in a fit of soul searching, has decided to perhaps rethink its current path, or at least that is what they would like you to believe. This particular irony is of a delicious nature because the Democratic Party purports itself to be progressive, yet they are about to choose between two paths, neither of which have anything to do with progress. The first, sticking with the status quo, aka the identity politics of Nancy Pelosi, is by no means anything new. The alternative, which has presented itself in a rather auspiciously young face in Ohio Congressman Tim Ryan, is actually a throwback to a very different time, just repackaged in a younger body. To fully understand this situation, we first need to understand the current makeup of the quote-unquote American Democratic Party and its purported progressive ideals. There have long been two groups within this political party that have been coexisting for a certain amount of time, and they don't necessarily conform to the broader scope of liberalism, which has become a bit more apparent lately with the ascendancy of certain popular YouTube bloggers such as Sargon of Akkad, Undoomed Bearing, and a few others that could probably best be described as classical liberals. No, when I speak of the American Democratic Party and its two various subgroups, I am speaking primarily of the old left, or the socialist but not identity politics driven old Democratic Party as embodied in Tim Ryan, and the somewhat newer but now still fairly old and weathered progressive wing or social justice wing of the party, which is best embodied in Nancy Pelosi, and I would argue the vast majority of the freak show that makes up the Democratic Party in both bodies of Congress. Tim Ryan represents something that on its surface appears a bit more attractive: a level-headed, working-class member of Americana as embodied in the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community, particularly of a blue-collar background representing workers and American labor in a Rust Belt state. It is further a curiosity that Tim Ryan was himself a former staffer of former and now departed Congressman Jim Traficant, who was perhaps best known as an outlier in the Democratic Party, a man who voted more often with Republicans than not, but probably stayed with the Democratic Party for pragmatic reasons, since his district was largely made up of blue-collar workers, aka liberal-leaning Democrats, but were probably nonetheless Reagan Democrats during the 80s. Tim Ryan is not cut from the same grain as Traficant. He does not vote in the same manner, although he does give an outward appearance of being of a similar pedigree. In truth, what Tim Ryan is more of a Bernie Sanders light embodiment, again in a younger body but still pushing the same ideology, and this can best be summarized in the way that he has tended to vote. The first major vote that came to my attention was one that took place in 2004, I believe, when he joined along with Representative Charlie Rangel of Harlem to push for the reinstatement of the military draft. This troubles me greatly, as I am not a fan of military drafts, although perhaps for different reasons than a lot of mainstream Republicans. He argued that Bush's reasons for denying the reinstatement of the draft were dishonest and were along similar lines to Bush's arguments that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and supposedly that the Bush tax cuts would create jobs. I would argue that the tax reductions that Bush put in place were pro-growth, but sadly they were not accompanied with spending cuts, which would have further kept inflation under control. But again, we're talking a moderate level of inflation compared to what we've enjoyed over the course of the past 7.5 years, which has been complete and total economic chaos, courtesy of Barack Obama, whom Tim Ryan supported fervently. But anyway, likewise, Ryan has also been a champion of protectionist policies, which would seemingly put him in a similar class as Donald Trump. In 2010, he introduced the Currency Reform and Fair Trade Act, which would have put punitive tariffs on countries such as China, who were engaging in currency manipulation. This is a subject that Donald Trump brought up frequently, primarily because it plays well to Rust Belt states. They have been hurt tremendously by the current trade practices that we have with China. And me not necessarily being an old school leftist and or socialist who's only concerned with low level labor, I have problems with this, but for different reasons. So I'm not necessarily hostile to the idea of putting punitive tariffs on other countries, particularly if they're hurting this country economically. But the other stuff that comes along with that, such as the ridiculous tax hikes that people in the Democratic Party support, are a non-starter. You can institute protectionist policies without destroying your own economy in the process, and that's what I would argue high taxation tends to do. And I would emphasize this by stating that in addition to his opposition to the Bush tax cuts, Tim Ryan was quoted as saying at some point in 2010 that tax increases on small businesses are necessary because we have huge deficits. We got to shore up Social Security, we got to shrink our deficits. Here's the problem. Tax increases do not necessarily increase revenue, particularly when you're also using said tax revenues to spend on things that are generally not productive. You have to have productivity in order to have revenue. You don't get productivity from bloated healthcare budgets and from Social Security. Social Security has nothing to do with revenue. So you want to take more money out of the private sector to shore up something that is gobbling up tax revenues and not yielding any kind of a return. It would be one thing if these people were arguing for some sort of a economic stimulus, which, as we've seen, also does not work. That was the biggest boondoggle in recent economic history, that 2009 stimulus package that Barack Obama passed. It was almost as brazen of a boondoggle as the TARP bailouts. But combined together, I would say that those two boondoggles were the most directly responsible for the current economic tumult that we've been experiencing. So what am I getting at here? On the surface, there are some in the classical liberal and in the conservative camps that would see somebody like Tim Ryan as an attractive rival just because he would be, on the surface, more receptive to points that one of us might make on something. However, in addition to what I've pointed out as far as his economic views are concerned, we should also consider that this individual, Tim Ryan, was also a supporter of the Stupak Amendment, which restricted federal funding for abortions. He had a sudden change of mind on this and suddenly became pro-choice in January of 2015. Now, there are only two possible reasons why he would have done this. One, he had recently decided to take on a female companion, someone by the name of Andrea Zetz, who was a school teacher, and this woman was probably a feminist and eventually cucked him into having a change of mind on the issue of abortion. That's one possibility. It took that about roughly 2 years to happen, but I would say that the more likely possibility is that Tim Ryan was starting to have party leadership ambitions, and you cannot have those if you oppose baby killing. So, what to make of the phenomenon of Tim Ryan? Personally, I think despite the fact that Tim Ryan may provide a helping hand to the Democratic Party in a leadership position, I don't think it's to be. I think that Nancy Pelosi is too well entrenched, and the reason for that is because identity politics is too firmly entrenched in the Democratic Party. I think that within 2 years, absent some miracle and Tim Ryan taking over and pushing the party in a different direction, albeit one that's not much better, the Democratic Party will experience record losses in both houses of Congress. I think districts that have been almost a 50-50 split will go red. I think that the House of Representatives could see as many as 20 to 25 additional Republican Party pickups, and I think there is the possibility of a potential supermajority in the Senate, particularly if certain states that received a Trump coattail vote that protected certain incumbents in the Republican Party this time around see the same coattails occur 2 years from now, which could be possible depending on how successful Trump's agenda is. Ultimately, the Democratic Party is at the point right now where they are on the brink of political oblivion. And the only way that they'll be able to pull themselves out of it is A, somebody like Tim Ryan comes along and redirects the party in more of a populist working class direction, or B, if identity politics somehow manages to weather the storm and becomes more entrenched in the school systems and manages to grab up a majority of the next generation, in which case it'll be biding its time for the next decade or two until it can fully metastasize, and then we'll be right back to where we were in 2009. Neither eventuality is appealing to me for different reasons, but suffice to say, I personally hope that Tim Ryan fails, because his failure would ensure the eternal defeat of the Democratic Party as a progressive party, and it may turn into something else that may be more beneficial, or it may fall by the wayside and another third party may rise to take its place. Either way, as long as the current regime that is still leading the Democratic Party gets nowhere near majority control of the country, I will be satisfied. So, speak amongst yourselves, let me know what you think. Until next time, with prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.